All right. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's Winter Garden Forum. My name is Lauren Williams, Adult and Community Services Manager at the Columbia Public Library, which is part of Daniel Boone Regional Library System. We are glad to be co-hosting this forum today with the Discovery Garden Club. This is our 8th year of co-hosting this forum, but this is the first one presented online. So we appreciate you being here with us for this experiment. Thinking about the promise of plants and starting vegetables in the spring makes this January cold and dark more bearable for me, and I'm sure for some of you out there as well. So I'm excited to be here. Just a couple of Zoom housekeeping items before we get started. We're going to be using the chat feature for Q&A today. So if you hover over your Zoom window with your mouse, you should see that chat icon. It looks like a speech bubble, and it's usually at the bottom of your screen, depending on whether you're on a computer or a tablet. If you're on an iPad, you may need to tap in the middle of the screen to see that menu come down from the top and choose more and choose chat. We'll have time for questions after each of our presentations today, and Janet Lindstrom from Discovery Garden Club will be moderating those questions from the chat. We also have a little giveaway to do in between our presentations as well. We are recording this presentation, so it will be available in the next 2 or 3 days on the library's YouTube channel for future viewing. So if you go to dbrl.org/events, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. If you go to that website, you can see a link there to our past programs. And now I'd like to turn things over to Janet Lindstrom with the Discovery Garden Club.
Hi, welcome everyone, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Discovery Garden Club to our eighth annual Winter Garden Forum that we've been doing very successfully with the Columbia Public Library. There are a couple of firsts for us this year. Not only is it our first Zoom webinar event, but it's the first time we've ever done the topic of vegetables. So that's actually kind of exciting and really very timely, because the interest in seed starting and vegetables has just been going through the roof for the seed catalog companies. So I think this is just a great topic for us right now, where we are in the pandemic. We have 2 speakers today, Carrie Hargrove from the Columbia Urban Agricultural Center, and Jim Quinn, who was a retired horticultural specialist from MU Extension. As Lauren mentioned, please submit your questions via chat, and at the end of each lecture, I am going to read as many questions as we have time for. And then in between the talks, it's been a tradition of ours to do door prizes. So this year we're going to be giving out, I guess, room Zoom door prizes, which are all gift cards, and we will mail those to you, to the lucky winners. And we have 5 of those. So let's get started. And I'd like to introduce Carrie Hargrove. Take it away, Carrie.
Hello, thanks, Janet. Thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Carrie Hargrove. I work for the Columbia Center for Urban Agriculture, and I am the operations director for that nonprofit. If you haven't heard of CCUA, we are a nonprofit in Columbia that teaches people of all ages, all backgrounds, about land and food through hands-on programming from seed to plate. And so that's why I'm here today. I'm going to talk about how to start vegetable seeds, and if I have time, I'll also go over wildflower seeds at your house during the winter time successfully. Okay, so to be successful in starting seeds from your house, you're going to need a few particular pieces of equipment, and I want to go over that just like right out the gate. I've been, a pretty avid backyard gardener for about 13 years now or so. And it has really taken me a lot of those years to realize like what I definitely need to invest in, and what I can maybe McGruber at my house and with good enough results. And so I'll go over my seed starting setup at my house, and all the equipment and stuff that I use. Okay, so I've got it actually behind me. So this is just a cart on wheels. That part's not important, but it's a shelf. And it's got, you can't see the bottom shelf, but it's got 2 shelves, but this is what we're focusing on today. And the reason why I like the shelf is because we mounted a grow light onto the top of the shelf. And this is definitely something you want to purchase. I went years without purchasing a grow light. This one has 2 T8 bulbs, It's 2 feet long, and it was about $115. I purchased it here in Columbia at a hydroponics store on Business Loop. And I went years without purchasing one of these because they're kind of expensive, but it really, it is the maker or breaker for success starting your seeds indoors. Vegetable plants need a lot more sunlight than like the house plants you see behind me. They will not accept indirect light, bright indirect light. They will get what's called leggy. So that means the plant just gets taller and taller and taller, searching for that sunlight or artificial light. And in the process, it gets weaker and it's floppy. It kind of like lays over, and that will kind of follow the plant throughout the rest of its life. So investing in a grow light right out the gate, I think, is a really important component. So for vegetables, I just use, like I said, they're a T8 like fluorescent tube light. There's 2 of them in my grow light. And as you can see, it's kind of like this bright, just white lights, full spectrum light. So I haven't used, the red lights or like the magenta lights. I think those are maybe more for flower production, and I don't know. This has worked for me, and that's what I use. So first, the light. Also, the distance from the light is important. As you see, I've got my tray is hoisted up on some like containers to get it a little bit closer to the light. As my plants get older, and in the case of tomatoes, as they get taller, I will take these away so that it can drop the tray down. But you want it pretty close to the light. Okay, so light, super important. Second thing is I have a heat mat right here. This is I'll move this tray out of the way. But I have a heat mat right here. And it's sitting on a piece of styrofoam that I found in my basement. The heat mat is more important than the styrofoam, but the heat mat is important. Or maybe not the heat mat itself, but supplying your plants with heat is really important. So most seedlings germinate best in like the 70 to 80 degree range. And if you're starting your vegetable seeds inside, it's almost guaranteed, of course, that your house is not going to be that warm. So the ambient temperature of your house, mine is 68 degrees, is not warm enough to get my seeds germinated and growing at a good clip right out the gates. And so if your temperature of your potting mix, and therefore your seed, like seedlings and their young roots, is lower than ideal, it's going to take them longer to hit certain maturity like benchmarks. And in taking longer to hit those maturity benchmarks, you're opening yourself up and your seedlings up for the possibility of more like fungus infections like mildew, something called damping off, which is when seedlings are too wet for too long, like too cool and too wet for too long. So having a heat mat or some sort of auxiliary heat source is really important to get those seedlings, out of the gates and running. So I just put my heat mat on a piece of styrofoam so it kind of spreads out the insulative properties of the heat mat. I've also used like a little like desk heating element that I got from like Office Depot, and it worked okay. I found there were things I didn't like about it, but it worked all right. This heat mat is from Morgan County Seed, which is not in Columbia, but you can purchase it online. It is from like an hour away from here. It's a good agricultural supply company run by a local family about an hour south of here. So that's where I got this. And they come in different sizes. So this is actually a really big one, but I have it kind of folded over the side so it looks smaller. So attached to the heat mat is a thermostat. So the thermostat is really important to make sure your heat mat doesn't run up to like 100 degrees or something. I don't have my thermostat set yet, but I'm going to set it to about 78 degrees once I get everything started. Okay, light, warmth, those are really important things. Of course, water, we'll talk about that. If you're a gardener, water is really important to plants. And then another really important thing is air circulation. So you want your plants to have some sort of movement and air circulation, one, to keep that mildew and fungal stuff at bay, and also to kind of like harden them up. If they live like inside your house where there's no air circulation, the temperature is perfect all the time, they get the exact amount of bright light, they're going to be beautiful, but they're going to be pretty like weak as far as like being transferred out to the real world in your garden. So having a fan on them that blows lightly, one, gives them good air circulation, which is what all plants want, keeps like infection down, like I said, but two, also starts that process of what we call hardening off, which is when you just toughen your plants up a little bit in preparation for transitioning from like the ideal environment you created in your seed starting setup to, you know, like the real world of your garden. So those are the main things that are really important in starting seeds in your house. I cannot state how important light and heat are. I went years without, you know, giving my plants I started inside my house either one of these and just put them on a, you know, sunny windowsill. And it's just, some house plants can handle like really low light and they just don't really grow, but vegetable plants will continue to grow looking for that light and they'll just get leggy. So I see a question that I'm going to address right now because it's timely. There was a question about how long you leave your light on. I leave my light on in between 12 and 14 hours a day, and you can get a timer so that you don't have to think about it. But 12 and 14 hours is a good amount of time. All right, so like I said, these are investments that if you want to do it well in your house, you really should invest in a heat mat or heat source of some type and a grow light. Okay, so because this is on a cart, I can roll it around wherever I want to in my house, but right now it's in my dining room. So right now I'm going to kind of transition to doing a little demonstration. It is really early in the season, but it's like just at the cusp of spring starting. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start the very first seeds for my garden at my house. I'm going to talk about what those are. So what do I got today? I'm going to do celery, celeriac, and escarole, I believe. I think maybe some parsley too if I have time. Celeriac is like a lot like celery. It tastes like celery, but it's like a bulb kind of. It's related to celery and it tastes like it, but it's not the ribs of the celery plant. Celery and celeriac are both cool season plants. They're actually pretty tough to grow in Missouri, so I'm just, you know, gonna keep trying to improve my skills. But it's going to take them about 10 to 12 weeks of growing indoors before I want to transplant them out after our last frost of the season. So that's around, the last frost is generally around mid-April. It's kind of all over the place in reality. But I'm going to start them now and just try to, you know, keep them happy in my house until spring rolls around. So what I'm going to do is I've got, well, actually, I'm going to do this one. I've got these, you know, really common things that I've just picked up from buying other plants at nurseries. I have some potting mix here. Let me rearrange my stuff. So then I filled the cells up with potting mix. This is just like an all-purpose potting mix. It's got peat moss, some perlite in it, some starter fertilizer. I bought the potting mix at Wilson's Garden Center, which is on Range Lane. Let's see, where is my celeriac seed? So my celeriac seed is really small. So it comes in this package, but inside that package, it comes in this package. So there's 250 seeds and they're really, really tiny. So I purchased these seeds from Johnny's Seeds, which is a really great company. I've got the catalog right here. And I wanted to talk about the catalog or the company really quick because Johnny's has a lot of really good information on plant growing. So if you buy seeds from them, or even if you just have the catalog, you can utilize the catalog for specific information. So I actually have it open to the celery and the celeriac page. And what I'm looking for is germination temperature. So it has, oh, you can't see it. but it has a little germination chart, and this looks like celery and celeriac germinate at ideally at roughly 75 degrees. So that is what I'm going to set my thermostat to on my heat mat so that I can get them to germinate. Because while I'm still also going to plant escarole, I really want the celeriac more than the escarole. So I want to make sure I have that at the right temperature for the celeriac to be happy. So these are really, gosh, you probably can't even see them. These are really, really small seeds. And the catalog says they need light to germinate. Not all seeds need light to germinate. In fact, very few need light to germinate. So I'm not even going to make any holes in my potting mix. I'm just going to sprinkle about 4 or 5 seeds per cell, which is what I'm doing right now, just right on top of the potting mix. Boom, done. Then I'm gonna put my seeds back in their little like wax paper envelope. I drop some on the ground. That's okay. Okay, so you can't tell any difference because the seed is so small. But what I'm gonna do is take 2 fingers and just kind of like gently press down, because you want good seed to soil contact. Roots don't really grow very well in air. They need to be growing through soil, although soil needs air pockets. But you just want to kind of firmly but gently, tamp the soil down after planting it. So then, very important, next step is to label. So this is one of my McGrubered like components, is you can buy like whatever popsicle sticks or I don't know, labels, plant labels and stuff. But this is just a yogurt container lid that I cut into like 6th. And then I'm just going to write the date and celeriac on it. So I'm going to do that real quick. Ooh. Because since I want to also grow celery and parsley, those are all related. So they probably look really, really similar as young plants. So I want to really make sure that I label it. Also, if you're a novice gardener, as you get like more successful in gardening, or maybe not even more successful, as you've done it longer, you start to be able to identify baby plants by their cotyledons, which are not their first true leaves, but are the first leaves that pop out of the seed. You start to be able to identify them and differentiate them. But if you're a very novice gardener, it's a great idea to be very cognizant about labeling so that you can start to identify those young plants. So this is my yogurt lid that says celeriac 131 on it. I'm going to push it down into just one of the 4 cells of my seed starting tray. Sorry, that started to slip. And then I'm going to set it on a tray that collects water. The heat mat that I have, although it is for horticultural use, like just because obviously there's like bacon involved with electricity and water, you want it to like you want something to collect water before getting to the heat mat. So this is a boot tray. I got it at Menards. Here's my 4 cells with celeriac, the label and the date right there. And boom, it is on, put it right under the middle. Now, the last thing I'm going to do for this celeriac is this is my baby plant watering system. I have filtered water in here, or rainwater. I prefer to use that rather than tap water because there's less like dissolved salts and stuff in it. So then you just really water it really well. The first time you water it, it will like settle the potting mix a little bit more, even, and gets that seed to soil contact even more like firmly in place. But you just want to make sure it's really well watered, starting to drain out the bottom holes of those cells, and then that's that. And then you can continue on with, in my case, I'll do also escarole, celery, and parsley today.
Carrie,
now I know.
Sorry, I had a request if you can tilt your camera down a little bit so that we can see the actual planting when you're doing the planting of the seeds. Thank you. I
can try, or I can lift it up. Maybe I'll just lift it up next time.
Okay.
My tripod doesn't go down like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I know that Jim Quinn is going to talk particularly about tomatoes at the next talk. And it's really easy with a system like this to start your own tomatoes indoors. Something like celeriac, like I just started, and something like escarole, which I will also start today, those can be grown, you know, until they're transplanted into the garden in this size container. Tomatoes, to some extent peppers and tomatillos, they kind of need to be they have like a two-step process. You can start them in something of this size, but then they need to be bumped up or potted up to a 3-inch round pot or something of that size a few weeks into their life, because they need to be started so long in advance, and they also get so big that they will get what's called root bound in something this size, and they need a larger container, and I don't have a larger container. If you're interested in particularly starting and growing your own tomatoes indoors, the organization I work for, the Columbia Center for Urban Agriculture, is doing a video that we will link on YouTube in March about how to successfully start and maintain your own tomatoes before planting them in your garden. So at Columbia Center for Urban Agriculture, we start all of our tomatoes in April, very first week in April, and we grow them for 6 weeks and transplant them out in mid-May. So we still have time. So if you're really excited about growing your own tomatoes from seed, you have plenty of time to get your system set up, get your seeds if you don't already have all that set up, and then watch the video that we are going to post on YouTube and our website around March. So there's some more details as far as starting your own tomatoes go. That will probably carry us over time today in this particular more general talk. But I'm happy to answer any tomato questions if anyone has any tomato starting questions. Okay, I think I have time to do another demonstration of starting your seeds, just like we did here, before moving on to my next topic. So I'm going to do escarole this time. So I got my container. It's got drainage holes. Drainage holes is very important. If you purchase something from, you know, a nursery store and just hold on to it, it will have the right amount of drainage holes. So I thought I buy potting mix in a very large like bale essentially. So I just have this pot or whatever of potting mix. So I just take my little tray and I just take handfuls of potting mix and I just sprinkle it into the 4 cells. Just something like this. Kind of like shake it. Sometimes I kind of like drop it from a couple inches to like settle the potting mix, or and then I kind of just like run my hand over it like you see here to kind of make it even along the top. So just set that down. I'm gonna get my escarole seed. So escarole, if you're not familiar, is it's in the lettuce family. It is more bitter than lettuce. It is used in French cuisine a lot. I just want to kind of grow a couple escarole plants because it's unique. It'll give me like escarole for a few meals, you know, a few dinners. I'm not going to grow as much escarole as I'm going to grow lettuce because salads for me are something I eat more often. But it's a beautiful, big, like head, very vibrant green, very crunchy. It's very good. A little more bitter than lettuce. So anyway, so it has seed that's small, but much larger than celeriac. So this is the seed. Gosh, I hope you can see it. So this is what one seed, this is like, gosh, you can't even see it. This is one seed. They're very tiny. So the tinier the seed, the more shallow you plant them, because that the seed has less stored energy in it, just because it's smaller. So anyway, I'm gonna get my tray, my 4-cell pack of what seem to be escarole. I always do a couple seeds per cell because germination is never 100%, even in ideal circumstances, and I can always thin if germination is close to 100%. So I just did a couple escarole seeds per cell. Then put my extra seed back in the seed pouch. I'm going to shut it. And then where the seeds are, you can't see it because there's perlite and stuff. You can't differentiate. I'm just going to take my fingers again and gently but firmly tamp down. And the escarole does want to be covered by the potting mix. So what I'm going to do is there's kind of like some potting mix along the edges that hasn't been tamped down. I'm just going to kind of like scoot that over to the middle to cover the seeds just barely, and then tamp it down again. So maybe by the end of the day, the escarole seeds are maybe covered by 1/4 of an inch of potting mix. And then just like with the celeriac, I'm going to get a label of some sort and label it. So I'm going to do that real quick. Label it with what it is and the date. Put the label in one of the cells, just like this, voila. And then put it under the light on the heat mat. So my heat mat right now is 67 degrees. I'm going to set the thermostat to 75, which is the ideal temperature for celeriac in particular. I think escarole will germinate just fine at that temperature too. And now I'm going to water with my filtered water or rainwater the escarole. Now, in real life, I would probably maybe water them a little bit more, but I just feel like you probably get the concept, and water it enough so it starts to drain out the bottom onto your tray or your boot rack in my case. Okay, so now for maintenance, how do I take care of these once they germinate or in the meantime while they're germinating? So I will say most things, in my mind at least, like a week is a good amount of time to wait for germination. Now celeriac and parsley and things in their family, some things in their family take forever to germinate. So the celeriac, I might have to wait 3 weeks before it germinates. So it's a real test of patience. So what am I going to do in that time to, make sure everything's going well? So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check daily for warmth, the light bulbs are working, and moisture. So what I'm going to do with checking with moisture, which is probably the thing I'm going to fiddle with the most, is I'm just going to take my hand and I'm just going to kind of like feel the top of the potting mix. If the top of the potting mix is damp, I'm good. But if it's dry to the touch, I'm going to top it off with water. There's a real art. You don't want to overwater because that can cause you just as many problems as underwatering. But you want to make sure they have enough moisture to moisten that seed coat, let the root pop out of the seed, and then let the cotyledons unfurl as well. Another thing I'm going to do, other than just checking to make sure the heat mat's always on and not too hot or too cold and that the light's working, I'm also going to turn a fan on. So I got a fan over here I'm going to turn on real quick. So the reason why I wanted to actually turn the fan on just now is because I want to show you how much like air circulation you need. And of course you can't see what that looks like. So I've got this spider plant that I want to put right here, and then kind of like settle it from me moving it. And so you can kind of see it moving from the fan. Now, so that's on the lowest setting. I don't want, it doesn't necessarily need to be like moving that much. It just needs a gentle breeze. The stronger the breeze, the more you're going to have to water because it's going to dry your plants out. So just a nice, gentle, like air movement to move some leaves. Okay, and so those are the things I'm going to do. Check the temperature, check the water, and check the light every day. Most things, or lots of things, take about a month. So escarole, well, right now, because it's cold and in a month it's going to be a little too cold, we'll probably be planting the escarole out in our garden in about 6 weeks. The celeriac will be about 2.5, 3 months maybe. A lot of things like lettuce, kale, Swiss chard, that kind of thing is about a month. So you got about several weeks of care in this state before you take them out and harden them off. And hardening off is just when you make the conditions a little bit more challenging before you actually transplant them so that they're ready for the real world. Okay. So for my last 5 minutes, I'm going to switch from starting vegetable seeds to something else you can do at about this time. We're getting really late in the season, but if you had native seeds and wanted to plant them, this is what you can do right now. So in my garden, I have a mix of vegetables and native plants growing together because while I don't eat anything from the native plants, they are very important to the health of my vegetable garden. So at the Columbia Center for Urban Agriculture in my own garden, I see them as, kind of a yin and yang of each other. They need each other. So I have natives growing all over my garden. So what you can do is, this is a milk jug that had milk in it earlier today. And then I cut a lot of it off, or cut it apart from itself. And I left one little thing so it dangles together. And then I don't think you can tell, but I poked some holes in it with a really small screwdriver. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this section up with potting mix and then put my native seed. Today I'm going to do some Baptisia in here. So a native seed needs what's called stratification, which means it needs to be cold for a certain amount of time before it can germinate. So that's why you always plant native seeds either in the fall or the winter. I started a whole bunch in milk jugs in December, but I thought I would do one more just because we're doing this demonstration today. So I'm going to use the same potting mix I used for my vegetable seeds. And I'm just going to, take clumps of it, fill up the bottom of this milk jug. And voila. So I'm going to do, what am I going to do? I'm going to do blue wild indigo. I got this seed from Missouri Wildflowers Nursery, which is down in Brazito. They're a great local company that sells really great native seeds to our area. It's really important, ecologically, to get seeds to get native wildflowers that are native to our specific area. The United States is so huge, there's a lot of native flowers, but not all native flowers are native to all regions of the United States. So I like Baptisia for a couple reasons. Baptisia is a nitrogen fixer, so that means it takes atmospheric nitrogen, and through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria, it puts nitrogen in a form that plants can take up through the soil. And if you're a gardener, you probably know that nitrogen is if you reduce it down to one really important thing, nitrogen is one of the most important things that plants need to grow. So it helps capture fertilizer essentially for my vegetable plants. Another reason why I like Baptisia is because it's this blue purple color, which in order to utilize all of the benefits of natives, it's good to have different colored flowers that bloom at different times in your garden, because then you're attracting a whole host of beneficial insects. There are more beneficial insects than there are not beneficial insects, and the more diversity of color, flower shape, bloom time that you have in your garden, the more diversity of insects that you're going to attract to your garden. And that just builds the ecosystem of your garden and makes it stronger. So the Baptisia seed is way bigger than either the celeriac, or the Escarole seed that we planted. So this is what a Baptisia seed looks like. So I'm just going to take my milk jug and I'm going to seed about 16 Baptisia seeds in a grid in the bottom of the milk jug. And then just like the Escarole and the celeriac, I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to, after I reseeded, and then I'm just going to kind of gently but firmly press down and lightly covering the seeds with about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of potting mix so that they're covered with the potting mix. Okay. And then I'm going to put the extra seeds back in my seed pouch. Cover it a little more because I didn't actually cover it with about a 1/4 of an inch. I could still see some. Pat it down. And then I'm going to water it really well with my squirt bottle watering. And then I'd water it better if you guys weren't watching me, but I'm on time limit, so I'm going to stop. And then I'm going to put the lid of the milk jug over it and kind of pinch it into the bottom. So it makes this tiny self-contained greenhouse. Sorry, it's a little hard to do because that's not how the jug is fabricated to be. So it looks like this at the end. And now I'm going to go outside and put it on the south side of my house with the rest of the jugs after I label it. It's always important to label. So this lets the seeds get really cold. It lets them experience frost, snow, rainfall. It gives it the cold that it needs to germinate, but it's in a contained system so that I am more of a vegetable gardener. I cannot yet identify Baptisia seeds from other native wildflower seeds at the cotyledon stage, but I know that this is all Baptisia when it starts to germinate, and I can just kind of pull the cube of soil apart when I've got the plants and transplant them into my garden. So that's a pretty easy way, pretty accessible way to start native seeds in your backyard garden. And so I like that method a lot. It's worked well for me. All right, so I'm going to wrap up. I could talk for days about this subject. So please let me know if you have any questions. But essentially, I just want to say as I wrap up that investing in heat and light for your vegetable plants is really an important component of success. And it's a great way to spend your late winter because everyone's ready to start gardening. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Okay, we have probably more questions than we have time for. One of the first questions that was asked was, how long do you need to leave the fan on?
Great question. So I leave the fan on most of the time. So my fan's right here. So it's I don't know, maybe 1.5 feet away from my starts. So I just kind of leave the fan on. It would be really nice if I had an oscillating fan because then it would come and go and, change directions and stuff, but that's not what I have. So yeah, the fan's just part of it.
Okay. And another question is how effective are grow tents around your growing area indoors? I think we've all seen those for sale in the catalogs, seed catalogs.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't had super great success with grow tents, and that's because, depending on the size, they can come in different sizes, but the smaller ones are so good at keeping the humidity level so high. And keeping humidity high is really important for young plants, but those tents, if they're small, can make air circulation quite difficult. And I've had lots of situations where bacterial or fungal issues take hold and there goes my starts because it's too perfect at keeping the humidity up. Now a larger system that maybe has some ventilation holes in it that lets air come through would be great. But if it's one of those plastic domes that fit perfectly over a 10-20 flat, you can definitely have success with that, but you just really have to keep your eye on if it's too moist in there, and you might have to take it off several times a day overnight. You just have to really keep your eye on it a lot more.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is how important are the measurements that you see on the grow lights? A lot of them have different numbers like lumens and kelvins. Is there a special grow light number you should look for or not?
That's a really good question. As far as grow lights go, when I purchased this one, I went into the hydroponics store and I said, I want to grow vegetables in my house. What is the best light for that? And so they showed me a couple different ones and I ended up going with this one. In my experience, which is, admittedly very limited since I'm predominantly an outdoor gardener, is is like the tube lights, like the tube fluorescent lights are better than the bulb, because you have, in my experience, like the plants stretch and lean towards the bulb more. It doesn't have as strong of an output across the larger like space. And then for vegetable starts, a full spectrum light is perfect. So I think this is not an LED light. This is like a fluorescent full spectrum, like T8 is what the type of bulb is called.
Yeah.
And it's always worked just fine.
Now, we all, actually, I noticed this too. You don't use a special seed started mix. You just use regular potting soil. Is that correct?
So this potting soil is like for nurseries, as like they, it can be used to like incorporate with other like potting mixes. So it's mostly just peat moss and fine perlite, and there is a little bit of fertilizer in it. Not much, but yeah, I've never purchased specifically seed starting potting mix, and I've always had good success.
Okay. And now, do you use the, I think you've answered this, but let's repeat it because the fan is getting lots of questions. What stage of growth do you begin to use the fan? Do you start right away?
No, I would wait until they've germinated, until like the cotyledons, for most plants, and the first 2 leaves come out. So I would, once those are out and unfurled, I would start the fan, because it's a really important component in making the plants stronger.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to kind of look for have time for a few more questions. Are there any easy plants to start inside that you would recommend for beginners?
Yeah, for sure. That was a great question. Head lettuce, boom, super easy. 1 month inside in your grow, like in this kind of setup, and then 1 month outside. In 2 months, you've got head lettuce. It's great. Kale is very easy as well. Swiss chard is very easy. These are all relatively plants that like need relatively short amount of time growing indoors before you can transplant them outside. In the case of kale and Swiss chard, you also have the benefit of them lasting pretty much all season long in your garden. The head lettuce is like you harvest it once and it's done, but those are probably the 3 I would recommend.
All right. Also, let's see here. So you don't need to add any extra fertilizer as they grow. Is this correct?
That's a great question. I don't, for things that I just mentioned, like head lettuce, kale, and Swiss chard, the things that are, only in this situation for a few weeks. What the fertilizer that's in the potting mix I found to be sufficient, and then I'll fertilize them when I transplant them out into my garden. For things that live indoors longer, like tomatoes and tomatillos, peppers, if I were going to do broccoli and cauliflower, those things that live indoors for longer than a month, yeah, I would fertilize them. At work at Columbia Center for Urban Agriculture, like at the Ag Park or the Veterans Urban Farm, we use some like organic granular fertilizers that we add to the mix for those things. At my own house, I would probably use like a liquid fish fertilizer, even though it's kind of stinky.
And I think we're going to have to wrap up the questions. There's a lot more. So I think maybe they can find some answers on your website. The one question that we have is, now when you, on your native plants, several people have asked this, do you water them outside or do you just leave them be once you put your milk jugs outside?
Great question. Okay, so I'm going to bring it back around. So I didn't water it very much for the demonstration. I would water it so much that water started dripping out of these little holes on the bottom, and that's what I'll do when I'm not presenting. And then once you put the cap on, there's a hole right here, but it really holds the moisture really well. And so I haven't needed to water. Like when it rained a whole bunch earlier this week, I took the caps off, and then they got, rain from, rained on. And then when it gets really cold, like it was like 14 or something earlier this week, the evening of that, I put the tops back on, and it's super, super cold. They just froze into a brick. So I haven't watered. I have found that when you plant things outdoors in the wintertime, it just requires, in most winters at least, it's wet enough and evaporation is slow enough that you really don't need to get your hose or your watering can out. Nature just kind of keeps it damp enough. I hope they answered the question.
Yeah, well, great. Yeah, you did. Well, I'm sorry we don't have time for all the questions. This has been a fascinating topic for me. I've learned all the things I've done wrong over trying to start plants inside. And Carrie, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us for this year's Winter Garden Forum. And
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
yeah, no, it's great. We've learned a great deal. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say thank you to Carrie, round of applause. And we're going to do our traditional door prizes, a little less traditional this year, but we've got some. So we have 5 door prizes, and I'm going to read the names right now and tell you what you've won. And to keep us honest here, Lauren Williams has done something magical with the registration list and has randomly drawn some names. So our first prize winner is going to be, we are going to mail all of these to you. So don't worry, you will get them in the mail. A $20 Giving Gardens gift certificate is going to Patty Cantu, C-A-N-T-U. So congratulations, Patty. Our next gift card is a $25 gift card to Helmy's Gardens. And that is going to Beverly Hine, H-E-I-N-E. Congratulations to you. Next is a $25 gift card to Strawberry Hill Farms. That is going to go to Mary Henley. Next is a $25 gift card to Vintage Hill Farms, and that's going to Rosalie Mason. And then our 5th gift card is a club member of ours is Christian Ramlow, is a licensed massage therapist. She's very good, and she has is donating a 60-minute, what she calls a gardener's massage. And the winner of that is Marcia, I don't know how to pronounce it, Showalter, S-H-O-W-A-L-T-E-R. You have won the gardener's massage. So with that, I think we're ready to move on to Jim Quinn, who's going to talk about growing tomatoes. Jim Quinn is one of our garden club's favorite speakers. He is a horticulture specialist. He's now recently retired from the University of Missouri Extension. So just like we did before, just submit your questions as we go along, and I will read as many as I have time for at the end. So thanks very much, and go ahead, Jim.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I've presented for a number of times around mid-Missouri with my extension position. I worked for University of Missouri Extension for 16 years. So for a lot of you, I've probably seen you before, and so I don't get to see you directly right now, but you get to see me. So good to see you all. And then there's probably a bunch of you that I haven't met before, so welcome this afternoon. And I get to talk a little bit for you to see me, and then I'm going to switch over to a PowerPoint. The way my computer is set up, my image does not display when I'm doing the PowerPoint, so you won't see me after that, but I'll come back for questions. So a little bit about the PowerPoint is used, a lot of it was adapted from what we use for our Master Gardener training, and I did a lot of the Master Gardener training through the years. And then I'm a volunteer with the Jefferson City Master Gardener group now. I have some expertise or some experience with tomatoes. I don't really consider myself a tomato expert by any stretch of imagination, but I've worked with the growers. I've grown tomatoes in greenhouses. I've grown them out at research farms, and I've grown them as a home gardener through the years, but I don't really think of myself as expert in that area. However, I did have a very good experience this summer. And of course, maybe that's because I was trapped at home with COVID like everybody else. And so I got to pay special attention to my tomatoes this summer. Also, I was retired. So I had a lot of good experience. And so I kind of felt, oh, this would be fun to talk about this topic this year. So I'm going to go ahead and put this PowerPoint up. And then at that point, you're probably going to stop seeing me till the end. So If somebody can confirm they see that, that'd be great.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is a little outline of what I'll go ahead and cover. And I do know that the library sent out to you a copy of the PowerPoint via a PDF. So you'll have that if you care to print it out. That could help you for those, especially the ones that maybe aren't as experienced, if you want to follow along and make some notes and such. So I'll have to move along on this topic a little bit quickly sometimes. Kind of get started with just is a tomato vegetable? Oh, yes, it is a vegetable, but the usable part is a fruit. So what gives on that? And it's because of the definition of a vegetable. It's any herbaceous plant whose fruits, seeds, etc. are used as a food. And so the key here is herbaceous. That is basically non-woody growth that's above ground. If that non-woody growth is just like an annual as opposed to a perennial that only grows one season, then it's an annual. Because it completes its life cycle in 1 year. And a tomato is an annual, as are most vegetables. Interestingly, botanically, the fruit is considered a berry. And then in your diet, since it's used in kind of savory method or salty, spicy ways, it is considered a vegetable by dietitians. So we do have some vegetables that are fruits considered by dietitians. So in other words, watermelons are a fruit as considered by dietitians, but they're cultured as a vegetable. Okay, a few fun reflections on tomatoes. It is a New World crop. It was not in European cuisine until the 1700s. The word is based from Aztec use. It initially was ornamental and thought poisonous. And the first case where they have a recipe for it as a tomato sauce was in the Spanish style, and it's from Naples in 1692. So I guess the Italians got there first in terms of having a recipe. But the tomatoes had been around since 1550. So it took them about 150 years to finally bring it into like cuisine, so to speak. So it is a warm season vegetable. It is also the most valuable vegetables, both in fresh use as processing use. We do eat more potatoes by poundage than we do eat tomatoes, but the high value of tomatoes, both fresh or for processed products, makes it by far the most valuable vegetable. It is extremely productive. You get a lot of tomatoes from one plant, and compared to a lot of other vegetables, for example, in that same space, there's no way you get 20 pounds of okra. So that's really great about the plants, the productivity. There's more than 10,000 varieties now, so there's just no way to talk about all the varieties. The vitamin C levels rival citrus fruits. So that was one of the reasons why it was so important in the pioneer and settler days, because they could go ahead and can and preserve tomatoes and then have that vitamin C supply through the winter. Catching some interest recently is the lycopene, which is an antioxidant, and there are some new varieties that have increased levels of the lycopene. So in terms of selecting the site, all these things are important, but I'm really going to focus on just two things here. So first off, sunlight is absolutely key. If you can, the more sun, the better for tomatoes, and it will also improve its foliar disease resistance. In terms of the amount of area you need, 4 plants is really enough for 2 people. And that basically is about 50 square feet. So you don't need a lot of space for 4 productive plants. And maybe you can find a really good sunny part of the yard to put those in. In terms of the vegetable soils that we would like to have, we want them well drained, deep, having the major nutrients provided, a pH from 6 to 6.8, and organic matter level of 5% or greater. Now, a lot of experienced gardeners start to laugh about this because a lot of times we have heavy clay soils here in Missouri, and especially in central Missouri. So this may not really be something that's easily attained, and we have to work to improve that soil. If this is all new to you and you're like, I don't know much about my soils, I would encourage you to go ahead and consider sampling your garden soil and submitting it to a soil test lab. The University of Missouri Soil Test Lab is a good one, and you can just Google University of Missouri Soil Test Lab and get the information from them about how to submit a soil sample and how much the cost is and such. And you can also take a soil samples to your local county extension center, they'll accept them there as well. So once you manure or using mulches that are natural, all those things help build up the organic matter. In terms of tilling recommendations, we usually say till once in the spring to create that favorable seed bed and incorporate the amendments you might add then. And then once in the fall, and the fall one is really important to till that as deeply as possible. That's the time when you get on the shovel and you turn it over 8 to 10 inches deep, incorporate organic matter or cover crops. It disrupts the pest cycles. And if you miss that opportunity in the fall, then try to do that as early as possible in the spring. And then if you do use a rototiller, which a lot of folks do, don't always rototill at the same depth. It's a temptation to do just run that rototill at that 4 to 6 inches deep all the time. You can create what we call a tiller pan, which is a hard layer. And that will restrict root growth. When especially if you run it during the growing season for weed control, that's the time to run it very, very shallow, just an inch or two. We know Missouri gets erratic rain through the summer, especially, and then it gets hot, things dry out faster. So we almost always are going to have to come back and provide some water. So tomatoes definitely prefer to be watered at the soil level, by trickle or drip irrigation, or else just watering with a wand around the plants. And that's because moisture on the leaves aggravates foliar disease. So one tip on starting your plants is that's actually the best time to hold back a little bit on the watering is right after they're transplanted and well established, which takes about a week. They are very drought tolerant at that point. They really don't need a lot of moisture. That's the time to hold that back, and it'll encourage them to develop deeper roots. Raised beds are ideal, and this is a good time where we can kind of compensate if we have a heavier clay soils because we create those raised beds. We can go ahead and add extra organic matter at that time. The raised beds allow the vegetables to root deeper. The soil warms up faster in the spring. The water drains more effectively. A lot of times we get these epic rainfalls in the middle of summer, 3-4 inches at once, and that water drains away from those raised beds then. And so if you are interested in making raised beds and information on that, we do have University of Missouri guide sheets on a tremendous number of different garden topics. We have one specifically on raised bed gardening. All our guide sheets have numbers attached to them. So this one's G6985, but you can also just do like University of Missouri gardening, raised bed gardening, and you should probably get a Google match with that. So look for more information on that if you're interested. In terms of mulching, it benefits the soil because it kind of protects it. It reduces the need to water as much, and it also decreases the incidence of diseases and weeds. The reason it decreases the incidence of diseases on tomatoes is because our foliar diseases are some of our worst, and they get onto the leaves by the rain splashing soil particles up off the soil onto the leaves. So if you put that mulch down, then the rain can't splash those soil particles up onto the bottom of the leaves. And there's a number of different options for mulching. A lot of gardeners prefer to use like landscape fabric because it lets the moisture through as opposed to using plastic. A high quality landscape fabric you can use year in, year out. Also straw or natural products like a layer of straw, wood chips, the shredded bark, compost, shredded paper, all these things can be used for mulches. So I once was talking at a field day out at a research farm, was asked to talk to the general public about tomatoes. And one of the things that's very interesting about tomatoes is the diversity of different types of tomatoes we have. So I kind of came up with this thing of where I talked about 5 ways to slice a tomato. So these are really important because these different characteristics are generally listed on any good plant tag when they're sold at the garden center, and certainly are listed in the discussion about tomatoes in any seed catalog when it's a good quality seed catalog. And I would like to verify what Carrie said about Johnny Selected Seeds catalog is absolutely outstanding for the information it has. And I believe you can get that same information pretty much from the website as well. So our 5 ways to slice a tomato here are growth characteristics is one, fruit characteristics, kind of the color and size of the tomato, and then the maturity, so how long it takes before it starts to produce fruit, and then the heritage or the breeding behind it. So in terms of plant growth, they basically are 2 groups of determinate types. These are smaller plants. They grow up to a certain height, then they stop growing any taller, and then they kind of bush out after that. And they give kind of an intense harvest period of like 5 weeks. These are very popular with commercial growers. Examples are like Primo Red, Tasty Lee, and they're also a good one maybe to plant one of that type in your home garden if you want a real blast of early season tomatoes. That's where I think a lot of home gardeners find a good match on the determinate type. Most of our cherished tomatoes that we really like to grow are indeterminate types, and these types keep getting taller. If you see pictures where they have tomatoes going up strings in greenhouses, those are all indeterminate types of tomatoes. And examples of those are some of our classics are like Big Beef, Lemon Boy, Brandy, Wine, and I'll talk about some of the varieties later. In terms of the fruit characteristics, there's so many different sizes, shapes, and colors, but colors is, there's basically about 8 different colors. The only critique I would have on white is that it's really hard to get a really purely true white tomato to the very end. Usually they kind of turn a cream color when they start to ripen. And then, we basically have our slicing tomatoes, which are round or oblate in shape and larger. And then we go to smaller size tomatoes. And of course, the smaller size are like our cherry and grape tomatoes, which are shaped kind of like the fruit description. And then we do have a kind of the pear or plum shaped tomatoes. And those are basically usually a little bit denser of type fruit. They have a higher soluble solid level. And so they are often kind of preferred for processing use or cooking. And so the one you'd probably be the most familiar with on that are the Roma tomatoes. So in terms of time to maturity, early season is less than 60 days after transplanting. So if you planted, say, May 1st, this would mean that right around the 4th of July or so, you'd start to get some tomatoes. Then mid-season is 68 to 80 days after transplanting, and then late season, 80 days, which almost puts you into August before you start getting tomatoes. So you definitely don't want to plant all late season tomatoes. You want to plant like a mix of these. And the late season tomatoes, a lot of times those are really bigger plants, and a number of those produce very large fruit, which is why people sometimes grow those. And then in terms of heritage, many of the tomato varieties sold are F1 hybrids. These are created when you cross 2 dissimilar parents, and then you get this seed resulting from that. And then that seed gives you particular qualities in the plants that are grown from those seeds. Heirloom vegetables don't use that type of advanced breeding technique. There are varieties that are considered older, and they should be older, more than 50 years old. And a lot of times those are like people created them in their own home gardens or certain situations, and they might have focused on taste, especially as why they favored them, or maybe some other unusual fruit quality characteristics, say color or shape or something. So the problem with some of the heirlooms is that they don't always have the benefits of the hybrids in terms of disease resistance, fruit cracking, or having higher or more consistent yields as you go through the summer. So you give up something with that. Now, I would say that the industry, the tomato breeding industry, has really started to focus on flavor more in the last, say, 10 to 20 years. So I think some of these quality of these tomato varieties are starting to improve. And I'll talk about that more later. So in terms of when to plant tomatoes, we want the soil to warm up enough. And in Missouri, that basically usually comes into that first week of May is about the right time. If we have an early spring, sometimes you can kind of hit it towards the end of April. If you try to go earlier than that, you might want to look at ways to kind of like protect your plants when they're planted out in the garden, which can be as simple with a small plant as cutting off a bottom of that milk jug and setting it over top of the plant for the first 2 weeks of its life out there. Use raised beds is a big benefit. You can also, if you're planting on the flat, you can just kind of mound up the soil, like just 2 to 4 inches mound can really help, because if you have a big rainfall and the crown of that plant isn't sitting in a puddle, it will really appreciate that. Use a thin layer of mulch until the warm weather really sits in. And so when I say thin layer, I mean like a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch thick of like straw or whatever you're using. Because if you get a cold spell and it's very wet in May after you first planted your plants, they can be prone to a root rot if the soil can't dry out some. And then I had mentioned also about holding off on the water until that first fruit is formed, which usually, if you're planting smaller plants at the beginning of May, your first fruit's probably not going to start to form until about mid-June, maybe a little bit earlier. Okay, in terms of spacing recommendations, your planting distance, it depends on the type of tomato. So our smaller plants, you can put a little closer, like 24 inches apart in the row, and then larger 36 inches apart. Really big vine tomatoes, you might even plant up to 48 inches apart. But you don't want to plant too close, because that can reduce air circulations, and then that increases the disease pressure. So that's a reason to really have them adequately spaced. And I'll show a picture of some tomatoes in cages here coming up. So tomato cages is often preferred to stake and string for home gardeners. It is a little more labor intensive initially, but you kind of save as the season goes on. We do need to support tomatoes up somehow, some way. If you just let them grow and sprawl all over the ground, you'll have a lot more fruit rot and foliar diseases on them. So that's the reason why people support the plants and hold them up off the ground. Use as tall a cages as you can, especially for the tall varieties. And then for these especially, you want to put a stout stake or a fence post adjacent to it for additional support, and tie it somehow to that fence post or stake. This helps because if you have a very productive plant, that cage gets all full of foliage, you hopefully have a bunch of tomatoes on there, and then everything's fine until you have one of those big raging thunderstorms in the middle of the summer where it blows really hard and rains, and that wet foliage makes that plant even heavier in the wind, and then it topples over. So use large enough mesh so you can reach in and pick your fruits. And then they kind of have this little COVID joke here of social distance. Tomatoes would be happy to be spaced very far apart. And so you can kind of scatter them around the garden if you want. Rain splash that hits one leaf and goes to an adjoining plant may spread foliar disease. So if one plant is more susceptible to getting a foliar disease, it can give it to an adjacent plant. So having them further apart will actually reduce foliar disease transmission between plants. And I'm not going to talk about staking tomatoes, but we do have information about that. If you want to look up at the University of Missouri Extension website, you can find publications about staking tomatoes. But usually there's this stake and string method where you put 2 plants between each stake, and you kind of weave back and forth. But this year was the first year that I decided to switch over to caged after quite a few years of doing stake and string, and I can assure you I'm not going back to stake and string. So to get the plants off to a good start, a lot of times people do something called sucker pruning. And I like to say, just keep it very simple. And that is just remove the first 4 suckers above the soil level, then stop. Don't think about it much more than that. It's not that big a deal, but they will benefit from removing those first 4 suckers. Reason we don't want to keep removing them is because then you get less foliage covering the plant, and then they're more subject to getting sunburn. So I've got some visual guidance here on the sucker removal. So first, in the picture on the right, we see with that black arrow pointing down, that's the typical size of a sucker that you would first start to remove. If they're smaller than that, it's hard to pick them out. So that size and bigger is what you want to go ahead and remove. And then in the photo to the left, lower left, that shows you tomatoes that didn't have enough leaf cover, and so the sun is shining on them, and then it causes a negative trait called yellow shoulders, and that tomato flesh right underneath that yellow shoulders will be real hard and not very edible. So in terms of fertilizing, we want to fertilize at transplanting, like 2 tablespoons of dry 20-20-20, or if you got a soil test, follow that recommendations, or you can just do some liquid feed right at transplanting. But what's really important is coming back at that 2 times later in the season and doing additional fertilizer. And that's because tomatoes really like a lot of nitrogen, and having more nitrogen will allow them to be more disease resistance on their foliage. So the time to come back is when we first start getting a nice amount of fruit set on the plant, and then about a month later. If you're an organic grower, what you want to do is you just want to use compost here instead of the recommendation here of 2 tablespoons. I would probably, for compost, about triple that amount. So a lot of gardeners are going to experience foliar disease on the tomatoes at some point through the season. Now, if it doesn't really occur much until September, you're far enough into the year and you've probably eaten enough tomatoes, you really don't care too much. When you start to have a lot of foliar diseases in June or July, that's when you kind of have anxiety. There's 4 different culprits for our common foliar diseases. Also, I would describe that as spots or dead areas on leaves. Some people call it blight. It's favored by wet weather and heavy dews. And so if you do start to have them, you can go ahead and try to do some spraying to help control that. Also like to mention that foliar diseases, some of them can develop into fruit rot or increase fruit rot. And so you see some photo there at the bottom of some fruit rot that's developing. So I got kind of my KISS, keep it simple spraying for conventional and organic. For conventional, use a fungicide containing chlorothalonil. And that's an easy one, is a Daconil broad spectrum fungicide, but there's other brand names out there. And then also spray with a copper-based fungicide. Those can either be mixed together and sprayed, or you could spray them alternatively, one week and the other week. If you're an organic grower, I would use Serenade, and then alternate that with a copper-based fungicide. Do not mix those together, but just spray them one week and that one the other week. So just directing you to the bottom of the slide, do you need to spray? The answer is no. You spray if disease occurs and you want to try to start to control it or slow it down. Or if you always have disease problems, then you would think about doing that. So there's a number of cultural tactics we're doing here to prevent diseases. We plant the tomatoes when the soil is warmed up enough. We minimize leaf wetness by using drip irrigation. Then we also do correct plant spacing and staking for air circulation. We reduce leaf contact with soil by the mulching. And then we can avoid working with tomatoes when the foliage is wet. And then last of all, remove and destroy all debris at the season end. I really encourage people to not try to take their tomato foliage, old residue and compost it, because your composting isn't going to be sufficient to kill off the inoculum. So use it somewhere else if you're going to do that. We have two very common fruit disorders, blossom end rot and cracking. The primary thing that aggravates them is wide fluctuations in watering. So if you just go laissez-faire and don't ever come back and try to water supplementally, you're going to be more likely to have that. Also, early maturing varieties are prone to blossom end rot. So even watering and mulching will reduce the risk to both of these. Now, some people just struggle with certain tomatoes having this problem. And the issue is, if it's certain varieties have this again and again in your garden, just don't grow those, grow some other varieties, because a lot of times certain varieties seem to be very prone to having these problems in certain soil situations. Our common insect pests are a couple of caterpillars, and then as well as stink bugs. So in terms of the caterpillars, the big tomato hornworm, you can try to hand pick those. A lot of times it's hard to find the really little ones. But there's a couple of good organic type insecticides for those. Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew is one, Dipel and Thuricide is another. And so those are easy to control with those. It's just seeing them in time. Stink bugs, I just kind of tolerate them, but I would like to note that dry weather brings them on. Also, if you don't water your plants and they get drought stressed, they will seem to be worse. The only way to really control stink bugs is with a synthetic insecticide, and I prefer not to spray that on my tomatoes. So some comments on summer temperatures. The optimal flavor and development for tomatoes is when we're having an average daily temperature of 75. Now, we all love that when we're having a low of 65 in the summer and a high of 85. I call that heaven weather. And the tomatoes love it too. Some people think tomatoes like hot weather, like when it gets to 90, 95 degrees. That's really not true. What happens is there's fruit on those plants, and that fruit is then forced to ripen as it gets hot. High temperatures during ripening often reduces fruit flavor, might impact the texture as well as the color. One notable thing that can happen is you can get internal white tissue that develops, real hard white tissue inside the tomato, as well as this yellow shoulders, and those are negative traits. So the best is to kind of just cut that stuff off when it happens, use what's the good portion of the fruit, and then try to do supplemental watering so that the plants don't get too stressed out. Hopefully, as weather moderates, they'll come back in and give you good fruit quality after that happens. Good vine growth shades the fruit from intense sunlight, will help protect against this. As the day length decreases towards the end of August, the fruit will tolerate high temperatures and sun exposure better. And that's because we have the sunlight level is so much lower. At the end of August, it's basically the same as what we had for sunlight level at the beginning of May. So it's just not as intense after that. In terms of harvesting, my suggestion is to harvest slicing tomatoes a little early, like when a red type, when it's turning pink, then store at room temperature until fully mature. The reason for this is that, especially like birds, they like to peck on fruit that they see turning really red. And so if you remove it when it's pink, they don't peck on it as much. And then you can do a technique of maturing green fruits in the fall, bring them inside, and have them ripe up over a long period of time. If you do like fried green tomatoes, that's a good time to make those. I do like to point out that fried green tomatoes is more about the breading and the frying than the tomato fruit quality. So a list here is the varieties I like to grow and the different types. I like to grow a couple of different types of cherry tomatoes. I like to grow a couple of nice beefsteak tomatoes, a pink and a red, and then another basic, just good slicer to diversify how much I have and maybe what's ripening up. And then a good yellow full-size tomato, just for having some color variation as well. And then took me a while to settle on on a heirloom I really liked. I tried Brandy wine, I tried Cherokee purple, and then a black crim, and I liked the productivity of the black crim and the consistency, and so I settled on it finally. And then for just like a cooking tomato, maybe some plum or Roma type. So those are the different names of the ones that I think are really good in those different categories. Of course, there's plenty of others, and you've all got your own favorites. But I would like to focus on Big Beef. It's kind of considered the standard as like one of the best home garden tomatoes, and as well as commercial tomatoes of kind of all time. So we'll kind of go into a little bit of a tomato tale on what's the best tomato. I would like to point out that these varieties are created by people who spend their professional career doing this type of thing. And the Big Beef was bred by Colin Wyatt. He also bred another well-known tomato called Celebrity, as well as a number of other notable vegetables. He kind of got recognized in a way that I call it's kind of the equivalent of winning the Vegetable Hall of Fame. So a little bit about what makes a great tasting tomato. Kind of it's a combination of flavor, texture, and sweetness. And so I'm going to first talk about this table 2 on the right side, and call your attention to Big Beef. And you notice it's got this score rating for flavor as well as bricks. So the flavor on Big Beef is 3.2, and then the bricks is 3.1. So you want to be higher on both of those categories. So if you can beat those numbers with another tomato, you're doing great. So there are varieties out there very competitive to flavor to Big Beef. Bricks is kind of measures sweetness, but it's a little beyond that because it's soluble, measures soluble solids. So it indicates sweetness, but it also indicates other things in there. And so again, you want to be higher than that. So I especially wanted to point out one here on this list, because we're going to come back to talk about it a little bit, is that Brandy boy there. I mean, not only does it really score better on flavor, but also look at the level on the bricks for it. So, you can do your own little taste test yourself. And we did one at our house this last year, and basically took it 1 week where I had my Big Beef, Pink Girl, and Black Crim were all just right at the right ripeness level to go and kind of compare them. And so my wife and I, my son, we kind of did this little taste test, and we really decided Black Crim for a rich flavor and meaty texture really kind of beat the other two, but the other two were just outstanding as well. So a little bit about kind of like where to go for some impartial recognition about good quality varieties and such. And there is an organization that provides a rating on some of these things. It's called All American Selections, looks at new releases and tells the public, hey, this is really good. It's primarily focused on the garden categories of flowers, mostly annuals, and edibles. And Big Beef in 1994 won the All-American Selection Award. And when it wins that award, they get to use that little sticker on it. And so if you remember one thing from this presentation, when you're going around this spring, maybe garden centers and looking at plant tags, keep an eye out for that sticker, because they really do like to put that on things that have won All-American selections. It indicates a really good variety. But since 1994, there's many new varieties. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what's hot right now. And I really like to talk, it's really kind of a tomato oxymoron. So it's an oxymoron because it's a conflicting statement in the using the word of hybrid heirlooms. An heirloom cannot be a hybrid. But what they're basically saying is we took these great traits from the taste of the heirlooms and we've put it into a plant that's now a hybrid. And so it doesn't have those negative traits of maybe less disease resistance and tendency to fruit crack and maybe not produce as well. So on your left is from a seed catalog, ironically Johnny's. And you see there down at the bottom, they say French hybrid heirloom type. So that's what people are using now as a description for these. And this Brandy boy I highlighted before was developed by Burpee. And, the Brandy wine beefsteak tomato was really regarded by many gardeners as having like just such a wonderful flavor. And I grew it in my garden 1 year, and it did exactly what that bottom statement says. The tomatoes were often misshapen. The plants grew kind of rangy and wild. They gave one big fruit set in like 1 week in August, and then that was it. So I never grew it again because I was so disappointed in its overall yield, but the flavor was great. So this Brandy boy supposedly doesn't have those negative traits. So some new tomatoes to consider. Now, I do want to say, the best things to always continue growing are your favorites. I'm going to grow my favorites as well. But if you're looking for to try something new, winners from AAS are like this tomato Buffalo Sun just won this last year. There's a whole series called Chef's Choices that have won over the last few years. And then like from our extension trials, I point out that Brandy boy, there was another release of one of these hybrid heirlooms called Martha Washington. That's a pink tomato. And then if you're looking for a hybrid determinate, Primo Red Deuce, BHN 589, or Tasty Lee, all are ones that you might keep your eye out for. Now, recognizing that not all garden centers are going to carry these plants. So this ties right into Carrie's talk, which is if something really perks your interest, hey, you can go ahead and buy the seed and grow the plants yourself, or call garden centers and ask them what they will be growing this year. If you are interested in All-American Selection and looking at the information they have on their websites, great website, easy to use. Lots of information. You can keep finding more and more information as you drill down into looking at specific choices. So this instance on this Tomato Chef Black F1, it has specific comments related to its flavor and yield. And it was comparing those tomatoes to black creme specifically. So I loved one comment here. Said entry is more flavorful, less disease, better yield, more uniform fruit set, and more vigorous plant overall, just not quite as black. So I am happy to take some questions here we have time for, and we might be able to run overtime if we want verbally here. I also am very happy to have you email me any questions you might have. I am volunteering with the Master Gardener program, so I get to answer those using my volunteer side of it. And I also do work with the Master Naturalist program as a volunteer, and with that, I'm really focusing a lot on pollinators. So I'm gonna stop the screen share now and take questions.
And we have quite a few questions. First of all, Jim, someone would like you to do a better definition of what do you mean by deep soil?
Deep soil would mean that it is
did you hear
probably around 8 to 12 inches where it fluffs up fairly well before you start hitting like a hard clay layer.
Okay. And then another person would like to know what are your thoughts on using the bagged manure or compost that you can pick up at the various stores around town?
I wish I could say I have a lot of confidence in those products, but sometimes I don't. And so I don't know if Carrie is still on, if she feels she has any source that she feels is really good. I do feel like Bluebird is pretty much okay, but my disappointment with a lot of those bag products they sell is they often lack any fertility rating on them at all. They just say, hey, it's got manure in it or it's got compost in it, and they don't tell you how much fertility value it is. Because when you buy fertilizer, it says 20, 10, 20, it means that it has 20 pounds of nitrogen, 10 pounds of phosphorus, and 20 pounds of potassium in it. And compost can do the same rating, like a 2-1-1, but they have to run a test to be able to make that statement on their bag. And very few of those products actually take the time to do those tests and then make that statement.
I am here, and I would just support Jim and you saying that Bluebird is probably the best like locally available compost to get.
We used to have a company that made a really good product, and they did the testing, and they made and so I would be able to support them. That was called Early Bird Compost, but they stopped producing their bag product now, so it's gone. And that was Early Bird, not to be confused with Bluebird.
Okay. The next question is, I'll just read it. My plants don't seem to bush out as much as those in your pictures. How can I improve the bushiness of my plants?
I would say it's probably due to, it's probably related to the vigor of the plants. And I don't know whether that would be if they're getting enough sun, or if their fertility is good enough, or a combination of those two. So it's just really paying attention to that. If you're concerned about the fertility, and especially when the plants are growing very well and they look kind of pale green, they don't look like deep green, it means a good chance they're short on fertilizer. So to pay attention to those, all three of those things is important. Plants started earlier in the season that get off to a really good start and grow robustly will often carry forward with better growth. I had this last year, because it was cold and wet late, I had some plants that weren't as big when I transplanted them as a couple of other ones. And it really set them back. They were set back the whole season. They didn't get the size of the other ones.
Okay. If you transplant tomato plants that already have started to set fruit, do you still recommend reducing watering?
No, in that case, I'm very happy that question got asked, because it is popular to buy like these gallon tomatoes. And one of the advantages of those is they have some fruit on them. And so a lot of times already formed or flowers already started. So what I would encourage people to do is, sure, plant 1 or 2 gallons, tomato gallons in pots like that, but also plant some smaller plants, because often plants, when they've already gone into the reproductive phase of growth, do not take off early season as vigorously as plants that are growing strongly vegetatively. But to answer that question specifically, no, I would treat them like you do a plant that's already having some fruit set, and try to give it more regular water.
And then another question is there a diameter for a tomato cage that is optimal? Because they do come in different sizes.
Yeah, really, in a perfect world, it would match to the type of tomato you're growing. So I got just the tallest ones I could find when I got them from Westlakes. I got the tallest ones I could find. And they were tapered, so they're thinner at the bottom and wider at the top. And they work just fine for me, even my taller ones. Now, what I did have to do that I didn't mention there, so I'm glad the question was asked, I did have to kind of cut some sticks, and then I kind of stuck them in at the top of the tomato cage, and wedged them in so that they extended the top of the tomato cage like another foot. And then I went around them with twine. So I kind of made 2 more rings with using some sticks and twine to let the tomatoes even get taller, and they still grew out of the top of that. So, the more bushy determinate types, so field growers sometimes will buy really large round cages that almost look like peony rings.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one more question, and there are actually so many questions. I really don't think we can keep going here. But I think, as Jim has mentioned, I think you're open to having questions emailed to your account. So anyway, one other question that is interesting is they're actually all interesting questions. How important is it to alternate planting areas season to season? It can be difficult when you're a gardener with limited space.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it is important if you develop especially root rot diseases for that particular plant, that's when it becomes critical. If you don't have a root rot disease develop with tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, or eggplant, you can grow the same plants again and again in the same place. I just really encourage people to grab those plants at the base at the end of the year and pull them up to get as much of the root system up as you can, and completely get rid of that plant top and any residue. And then when you replant in that area the next year, using the mulching to avoid the soil splash. And then that does allow you to reuse that same space year after year.
Okay. Oh, I guess I'll do one more question since it's one of my favorites. Is what about deer? Is it okay to use deer repellent on the tomatoes, like liquid fence or similar products?
Boy, you have to follow the label on that. I noticed that this last year I got some liquid fence that I was planning on using on stuff, and when I read the label, it did not say it was okay to spray it on a plant that was edible that you were going to use. So I was looking more to use it if I needed to on some fruit trees. And so what I decided I would do is I would probably apply it on the trunk and hope that the stink pervaded the area and dissuaded whatever critters I was trying to. I was having problems with squirrels. So you might try spraying the base of the plant and around the plants, but I believe if you look at the label of liquid fence, you're not supposed to spray it on something that you're going to consume within like a certain time period. I'd say probably 2 weeks.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to need to wrap it up. I know that Jim's email has been posted on the chat, so people that have questions can go ahead and email him. And I also the same is true for Carrie. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this first Zoom webinar. Hopefully we'll be back in person next year at the library. It's always the last Sunday afternoon in January, and we try and have a variety of local experts that answer garden questions for everyone. So Lauren, did you have anything to say?
Nope, I just want to say thanks all for attending, and thank you, Janet, for letting us be a part of this. Happy gardening, everyone.
Yeah, okay. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.